So what I wanted to start with was I wanted to focus on your Atlantic piece and sort of walk people through that because I feel like it's a piece that can do with a lot of sort of unpacking and looking at what you're saying, because you're really making what seems to me a cultural argument in addition to an economic argument, which I find pretty interesting and is not something you see typically when you hear people talk about ways to fix this mess. You hear about relatively focused technical corrections, but not something that sort of looks at a large scale at what has happened on a cultural level to bring us to this point. So what I'm to start with is just your IMF experience, your other experience working with developing nations, and sort of walk people through what that process looks like when a developing nation finds itself in a mess.
Okay, well, there's obviously lots of different kinds of crises that have happened to developing nations and other people. But the kind of crisis that is very common and that I think most closely resembles what we see now in the United States is the following. You have a boom, and the boom is based on, initially totally sensible fundamentals. Maybe you discover some minerals, or maybe you just get more modern in some sector like finance. And you make good money, and you get good jobs. There's nothing wrong with that. And you start to attract capital in, and the whole thing becomes self-perpetuating, particularly as a sector becomes more powerful economically, or bigger economically. It can become more powerful politically, because people sensibly plow their money back into more political privileges for themselves, either more regulation or less regulation. Usually they want less regulation. And this, doesn't stop the boom by any means. If anything, it may feed into it, and the foreign investors say, "Ooh, this looks good because we could invest in this sector." For example, manufacturing in Korea, or the clove monopoly in Indonesia. These were cases in the 1990s. And not only is there a good economic case here, but these people also have the ear of the president and the power structure, so we were sure to get a good deal. Now this, again, keeps going, but the people who run this business, the oligarchs, if you like, for want of a better term, it's a fairly descriptive term, powerful economic power and political power intertwined and very concentrated. These people get carried away. They overborrow, they overextend, and then either it collapses of its own accord, or more commonly there's a shock for emerging markets that comes from the outside, and that precipitates some combination of a banking crisis, a budget crisis, and a crisis for the currency, and a general collapse. At which point the IMF comes in and often is invited in and tries to stabilize the situation. And the IMF's perspective, it doesn't use these words. Okay, this would be very awkward to say this too publicly, but the IMF's assessment by the staff and what the IMF tries to do is very much break the power of the oligarchs. For example, by taking away some of their banks. For example, by having the government nationalize some of the banks that got themselves into the biggest trouble, and otherwise changing fundamentally, I would say, the structure of the relationship between finance and industry. That's a pretty core issue. So apply the same thing to the United States. So that's what we suggest in the Atlantic. And my contention is what the IMF would say to the United States is, you have exactly an emerging market type situation. The IMF, of course, is not allowed to say that to the United States.
Right. Well, to walk back a little bit, so I think it seems like one of the key things that needs to happen is the private sector and the government need to sort of come together in such a way that they're acting as almost like a single force. In other words, that the government is marshaled for the forces of the market in the country, and then things fall apart, and there are certain pressures put on the government that needs to act. So to just bring the analogy over to the U.S., you give another examples of how we can look at what has happened in the U.S. and say here's evidence the private sector, or the Wall Street in particular, the financial sector, working together with the government to make things, boost the market. You point to deregulation. Essentially the last 2 decades of regulatory policy, I guess in particularly the last 8 years, that sort of thing. But sort of the wide argument that I wanted to more focus on was, you write that just as we have the world's most advanced economy, military, and technology, we also have its most advanced oligarchy. And you call that the belief system, this idea that in your typical developing nation, you have perhaps the oligarchs, the moguls have violence on their side to keep things in a certain order, or money is the corrupting influence. But in the U.S., it seems much more nuanced and perhaps more sinister, depending on how you look at it. So what I wanted to ask you, reading the piece, it seemed to me that you might essentially be making an argument that we have been brainwashed on a cultural level to believe that what is good for Wall Street is good for the country. Do you think that's a fair read of it?
Yes, I do, actually. There's no harm with the sector making the case for itself, and everybody does it. That's integral part of having a democracy. But I think when a sector becomes too powerful in this context, or maybe in most countries, it tends to distort thinking, distort beliefs, and I think this is really very important for current policy. I think that the banking system needs to be recapitalized. We need financial services going forward. But we need to have a financial rescue or bailout set of policies that favor more the taxpayer and more ordinary citizens vis-a-vis very powerful bankers. And I think what's happened is that the policy, particularly in the past 6 months, has too much reflected this growing power of the financial sector, which has been with us at least for 30 years, and which has really been behind the development of these massive vulnerabilities that we have, and of course other countries have. And the development of those vulnerabilities, of course, has been particularly manifest in the past year and a half.
So to sort of look at some of the other evidence that you look at as sort of evidence of this, we have this sort of the back and forth between Goldman Sachs and people who run the Treasury in the United States. And something that doesn't seem to be limited to Republican or Democratic administrations. You have, Paulson and Rubin both connected to Goldman. We saw the news last week with Larry Summers, the fees from hedge funds and also other Wall Street firms. Geithner's chief of staff was a lobbyist for Goldman Sachs, and then I think they've also nominated a deputy who used to be at Treasury and then went to go work for the Hartford, which is an insurance company, and was an executive there. And one thing you don't focus on is Fannie and Freddie, which, to me, if you're looking for a good example of sort of Wall Street getting marbled in and sort of its interests being indistinguishable from the government, you have Fannie and Freddie, which I think is very unique entities that sort of acted with governmental backing, but also had some activities which you could pretty much describe as hedge fund type activities with the backing of the government. Is that a good survey in your mind of sort of the interlapping that has occurred?
Yes, I think that's fair. Fannie and Freddie, of course, was set up to try and promote home ownership, try and lower the cost of borrowing, and they have had some success in that regard. And I do support the current policies with regard to them strengthening Fannie and Freddie on both the lending side and in terms of their ability to take over problematic mortgages and restructure them. And also, I'd say that they have some good programs in terms of trying to keep people in their houses when they fall way behind on their loans. But of course, you're right that Fannie and Freddie became very powerful politically, and they used that. They were known to be some of the most aggressive lobbyists in Washington, and they used that power to shape their regulatory structures and regulatory environment to their advantage. I think there's pretty much general agreement on that. To the extent to which they were run as hedge funds, I think that might be more open to debate. Not all the bad things out there, not all the problem things out there are hedge funds. Many of them are just regular banks that somehow mismanaged their risk, and so it's a pretty I would use a broader set of terms for both the private sector, pure private sector entities that got into trouble through their own greed and stupidity, sure, but through really being able to shape up the regulatory environment in their favor, and then also these public or quasi-public or somewhat backed by the government entities, Fannie and Freddie. And I think the common element across them is exactly what you were saying, which is too much power, too much Wall Street type mentality, and it shouldn't happen again, but it probably will.
But if you're essentially saying that this is a cultural condition, then is it something if you get rid of the bank CEOs, you get rid of bank leadership, maybe in the future you try to have a greater diversity in terms of who comes to power in government to oversee these banks. If you take all those steps, but there's still, do you still have that problem of, is there a basic worldview change that needs to take place, and is maybe the current financial crisis the thing that's going to bring that change?
Well, you're right. I think in what you're applying, which is the change is going to be very hard, and it's cultural in the sense that it's a system of beliefs. It's not, I think, a deeply rooted, integral part of the American culture or American business culture. I think of that as being much more entrepreneurial, much more favoring startups, much more favoring actually small players relative to big players. I think what we've got here is a distortion of the American business culture, which is twisted way too much towards big players. I think there's a tradition in the U.S. of being very suspicious of big players, and we had the antitrust movement 100 years ago, slightly more than 100 years ago, precisely for that reason, and it was quite effective, I think, in what it was trying to do, which is contain the power of the most powerful. So I think that you can make progress. I'm not a pessimist. It is tough. It will take a long time. I think you've got to break up the biggest banks. I think having our current financial structure is just not sustainable. I think that these big banks get too much political power, and they will use that to shape the playing field in their direction. And we should, prevent that. And the only way to do that, you can come up with sophisticated regulatory ideas, but the only way to really do that is to break them up into smaller pieces.
Right. Well, we'll get to that a little more depth in a moment. So we've gone through the ways that the U.S., in your views, is similar to some of these developing countries and the systems there, the oligarchy. But I wanted you also make a note that the U.S. is very different in a couple of key ways. One relatively simple one is the fact that the IMF isn't there and isn't the only way out. It doesn't have the same leverage, or any leverage over the U.S. But there's also this issue of, in a developing country, you have reserves that might be dwindling, and the U.S. has a very unique situation with its currency. So could you talk about that a little bit, just to explain to people just why that is such a difference?
Sure, and there's obviously very important differences, some of which are strengths of the U.S., but there's a little bit of a mixed blessing. So take, for example, the currency. The U.S. dollar is the preeminent reserve currency for the world, which means that that's the currency that most countries want to hold their reserves in. And that's a good thing, and I'm in favor of that, and I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. But it creates the following complication, that you don't get a crisis in the U.S. The same problems that in an emerging market for sure would have produced a crisis, including a crisis in the currency, a big fall in the currency value. In the U.S. have destabilized. The U.S. has these problems that we've destabilized the world, honestly, and as a result, the world wants to buy more U.S. dollars. So that's the exact opposite of what would happen for an emerging market. And people buying U.S. dollars pushes up the value of the dollar. It does hurt our exports, it's true, but it doesn't precipitate a crisis. And as a result, I'm not in favor of crises. I think crises sometimes can go very badly. But you can see that in the U.S. we may be able to keep the current situation going much longer than would be the case in an emerging market, because when the chips are down and the going gets tough, people buy U.S. dollars.
Right. So I guess in a way, instead of having extra pressure in the U.S., we've basically been given extra breathing room as a result of our unique situation, is what you're saying.
It means there won't be you don't get the same moment of confrontation and of looking at yourself, looking at your elites and saying, "Ooh, this is bad. This doesn't add up." And we just had a calamitous 50% collapse in the currency. We need to act now. And of course, that's the context which the IMF often comes in. And I'm not, believe me, saying the IMF always does the right thing. The IMF's decisions are often very political. They're often, by the way, shaped by what the US wants to do in various countries, and the US often doesn't want to undermine the elite or the oligarchy. Let's keep that in mind. But the IMF staff members, I would suggest, always see through this, always understand the power structure. These are very smart people with a lot of experience and very cynical, hard-headed. Whether they can put in place the kinds of changes that are needed is another matter. But they see to the heart of the situation, and they see exactly the kinds of symptoms and deeper problems that we have now in the United States. They've seen them many, many times before.
So I guess one question I have is part of what the U.S. Is going through, you've seen before, you've seen how it played out in developing countries. Is there an example of a country with our relatively unique set of circumstances that is, it's the U.S. not a developing country, no IMF pressure, no the currency reserve, there's not the pressure there. Is there an example of a country being in that sort of situation and nevertheless getting tough on its oligarchy?
Not really. I mean, I would not want to say there is a direct parallel to our current situation anywhere. I mean, to have the world's largest economy with the reserve currency hit this kind of wall, perhaps we could go back to the Great Depression and talk about the way that FDR reshaped certain key government institutions. I don't think it was exactly undermining the oligarchy in the same way, and that's one reason that the Great Depression was so prolonged, of course. But it did substantially, for example, setting up a SEC, having it headed by Joseph Kennedy, who was a former very accomplished stock market speculator. This was the kind of thing that made sense. I would go back, though, to the antitrust movement, end of the 19th century, associated with Teddy Roosevelt, but of course it was much broader. Now that was not precipitated. That movement was not precipitated by the kind of external crisis we're talking about, but it was brought about, I think, by the growing awareness that some industrial conglomerates had become way too powerful. And so there was a reaction within society and in politics to that, and that obviously took quite a long time to play through, but I think ultimately it came up with ideas and policies and laws that made economic sense, that were consistent with further growth, and that did substantially undermine the power of the oligarchs, or would-be, let's call them would-be oligarchs, at the end of the 19th century. So I think, to me, that reform movement, at the 120 so years ago, is the right model for what we're looking at going forward.
And that was sort of a grassroots political pressure that, in your mind, brought that.
Well, I think it's a combination of grassroots political pressure, but also the fact that a lot of smaller businesses were not happy by being squeezed out, for example, by Standard Oil. So I think and I think you see this today as well. I'm hearing a lot of support from people who are in business, small, medium-sized business, even people who are in the financial sector, by the way. Many of them support the arguments that we're putting forward in the Atlantic piece. And I think that's because, if you've been on the front line and you've been up against these big players, and if you've been crushed by them, or if you've seen the kinds of crazy things they do, you're aware that this is really a very bad situation. Whereas I think broader society has kind of a vaguer notion that something really bad has happened, but they can't articulate it as precisely. Whereas people who've actually been there really know what they're up against. And I think people who experienced Standard Oil up close and personal and in a nasty way in the 19th century were among its most articulate opponents.
So, to bring us to the present day, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what the government response has been, which you call a velvet glove approach to the banks. So just for an overview, there's Fannie and Freddie, which was the first intervention, and so far there's been about $60 billion put into Fannie and Freddie, and that's obviously a unique situation in that they are being, in many ways, used as arms of government policy right now, but there's also a lot of accounting for the activities of the past several years. Then you have the banks of the bailout of the banks, which, if you include Citigroup and Bank of America, from the Treasury side, that's about $260 billion that's put in. AIG, the bailout total is about $180 billion. They just rolled out this toxic asset purchase program, which is about $100 billion. Foreclosure, program, $50 billion, auto bailout, which is currently at $25 billion, and then you have obviously what the Fed has been doing, and the FDIC, which is a toll that I think people put anywhere between altogether $4 trillion and the possible outlays extend, I think, all the way up to $10 trillion or so. To get into this issue of nationalizing the banks and breaking them down, you refer to this sort of approach that has been used so far as sort of a case by case, bailout by bailout type way of doing things. And Elizabeth Warren, who was on the Congressional Oversight Panel for the TARP, has a report today looking historically back at different government interventions, and she basically says that when you have a troubled financial system, you have three fundamental different policy alternatives, and she says they are liquidation, receivership, or subsidization. And I imagine your way of looking at things is we're currently on the subsidization route of those three alternatives. So, in that looking forward, that seems to be relatively the way that they're trying to get out of this crisis. So, before we make the case for nationalization or receivership, could you just walk us through why you think the subsidization route won't be effective?
Sure. I think they've tried substantial subsidization, but there's a fourth policy or route which they're now actually taking, which is forbearance. In other words, you just kind of sit back, you cut the bank some slack with regard to how their assets are marked, and you kind of think they're insolvent, but you don't want to ask in too pressing a manner. I think that's why the stress tests that they've designed are pretty weak. And you hope that the real economy recovers, and as the economy recovers, you will see improvements in the banking situation. Now, it could work that way. I think people who were engaged with these issues in the 1980s say that is what happened after the debt crisis broke in Latin America and elsewhere after 1982. That U.S. banks were insolvent, but nobody really pushed them on it, and they eventually got better. I don't think in this situation that's going to work. I think there's far too much going on globally. I think the real economy continues to deteriorate. And I think there are speculative runs. It's easier to have a speculative run right now on the government attacking the credit of major U.S. banks. I think that's exactly what's happening. People are shorting various banks, and they're pushing to see what the government will do in terms of support. The problem with subsidization route is, first and foremost, you run out of money, and you run out of money vis-a-vis Congress. Congress is not happy with that. You could get out of it through subsidization, through massive subsidization. I'm not in favor of it. It's not a good deal for the taxpayer. And my blog, my website, Baseline Scenario, has been arguing, in the trenches, deal by deal on this. And I think we've got eventually a reasonable amount of traction working with other people. And I think that that's part of why people have become sensitized to this. Well, that's not just saying you can't subsidize, though, is not the end. You have to look at these other options, and they're the Congressional Oversight Panel is, of course, right, that you're coming down to either liquidation or receivership. And I think the liquidation is kind of scary because pushing a major bank into Chapter 11 would have all kinds of untold consequences. So we're really talking about a form of receivership, and a form of receivership in which you don't have much cash to put into these banks. And we know that as you wind them down, you'll lose more money. So I think that realistically, and arguably, unfortunately, well, it's unfortunate we're in the entire situation, let's say, but realistically, we're going into a situation where there will be debt for equity swaps. At least the bondholders who have a claim on the holding companies, these massive conglomerates, they're mostly organized as holding companies, they will be converted into equity. What happens to derivative transactions remains to be seen. They may be relatively protected. I'm not sure about that. But I think that we're heading towards some form of receivership. It's going to be very messy. It's going to create more problems for the real economy. I wish we had done this differently, way back in September, October, when we first started arguing for a different approach, an approach of government takeover, recapitalization, and reprivatization is what I would call it. But I understand that that train has left the station.
Right. Well, I think it's made the point that at some point Treasury does run up against the wall of needing to get more money from Congress And obviously they're trying to use the Fed and FDIC in certain ways that might put that day off. I mean, obviously look at the Toxic Asset Purchase Program. There's FDIC financing, there's Fed financing. It's a way that actually uses I think relatively little Treasury capital, as a percentage of how much is going to be deployed. But that is a good point that it's not as if we're acting without any pressures. There is the pressure of Congress. There's the pressure of people who are, the bailout is generally very. It's not a popular thing. So. I'm just bringing us back to our earlier discussion of the uniqueness of the U.S. situation and the lack of pressures on what's happening. But it's true. It's you should look at that sort of pressure. And it actually seems to me, I don't know if you saw this, there was a Politico piece, I guess it was end of last week. It was a write-up of Obama's meetings with the CEOs from the various banks, I think late March. And he reportedly told them that my administration is the only thing between you and the pitchforks. So I guess the issue here is how long he's going to be able to stand between them and the pitchforks, and the sort of pressure is bearing down.
If I could cut in there, I actually think that's exactly the wrong way to think about it. I don't think it's populist with pitchforks against bankers.
Right.
I mean, the support that I'm getting is partly from populists, but partly from many mainstream economists, lawyers, finance people who are left of center, dead center, and right of center. Okay, these are people who think that the system fundamentally is broken, and who are angry, sure, but that their anger. This is not about their anger, and this is not about their populism, however we want to define that. This is about them saying analytically and professionally, oops, I think we've got the wrong kind of system here. We need to back away from this. And I think positioning it as the guys with the pitchforks are coming to get the bankers, which is what the Economist did in their issue last week. I actually don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think that actually helps the bankers, because then you say, oh well, obviously pitchforks, that's an excessive reaction, and people are just angry about AIG bonuses and so on and so forth. That's not it at all. Not at all. I think the AIG bonuses are, perhaps crystallized some emotion here, but the real underlying fundamental problem is the financial system got too big. The governance of that financial system was undermined by the economic clout and the political influence that it acquired. That encouraged and allowed excessive and actually crazy risk-taking. And when it blows up, it's a huge problem because the sector is too big. That's not about populism. That's about good, standard economic thinking. And, the fact it's taken us a while to get here just tells us that economics needs reworking as well as the economy.
So the president using the pitchfork analogy to you is just another emanation of this belief system, in a way. That it's sort of this idea that, there's a certain radicalism to, attacking Wall Street or suggesting. I was going to get in a little bit to David Brooks's column that was sort of in response to your Atlantic piece, but he basically did imply that what you were proposing was a radical solution, which I think would go hand in hand with the pitchfork way of sort of labeling what people are feeling when they see, for instance, the AIG bonuses or something like that.
Right.
Did I have a fair statement?
I'm not a radical. I was the chief economist of the IMF. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship at MIT. Okay, I work with people who set up companies. I try and help entrepreneurs around the world. That's my view of what matters for development. That's how I think incomes get brought up. That's how I actually think poor people get helped in part and substantially. Okay, my point of the Atlantic article is to say that this perspective I'm bringing is the perspective of the IMF, which is the most, in some senses, sort of traditional standard macro organization out there working on macroeconomic crises of various kinds. They will come into situations and say, oh, this has gone way too far, this oligarchy got too powerful, we have to find ways to break it. They will articulate that position in somewhat more technical language, but if you talk to them about it, and don't take my word for it, go find an IMF staff member or former IMF staff member, buy them a cup of coffee and ask them these kinds of things. they'll tell you what's the power structure, what the underlying problem is, and what the constraints are on their ability to deal with it. This is how the world really works. And this is, when the IMF is called in because there's a total breakdown of the economic system, this is what it's about. We should apply, my point is we should apply that same reasoning and perspective to ourselves, and it's more than a little bit enlightening.
Right, so, I wanted to bring us into where we are now and sort of the practical facts of receivership and how it would happen. Geithner has said essentially that he didn't have the actual power to handle, or the Treasury didn't have the power to handle the IAG situation the way they would like to, and they've gone to Congress to ask for legislation to handle, I guess, the solution or the control of non-bank companies, which they say they don't have the authority to have. I guess first thing, in your mind, does the U.S. have all the authority it needs to have presently without this legislation to do what you're proposing, which is receivership?
I'd accept the point that under the current legislation, it is very difficult to have the kind of approach that would make sense. And I think seeking the resolution authority is a sensible step. I don't know why it wasn't done a year ago. And I have to say that when I was at the IMF, we were suggesting quietly, because that's the way the IMF works vis-a-vis the US, they do exactly this sort of thing. So there was to me, a completely puzzling delay, and also why this power wasn't sought immediately after the problems with the AIG, when it was, apparently, according to the participants, obvious they didn't have the requisite authorities. Again, an even bigger puzzle. Okay, but we are where we are, so right. Let's go get the authority now. I don't think this authority is a panacea. I think that having the authority will further, and asking for the authority at the moment of crisis, has further worried people, and this is leading to a credit run, a run on the credit of some big banks, and a run on, if you like, the authority or the potential authority of the U.S. government to bail them out or to save them. And given that they can't draw on any substantial funds from Congress, and the Fed's ability to get involved by itself in this kind of rescue is limited, I think we have a very, very big problem here. And I would not, I don't want anyone to get the idea that what we've been proposing was a magic bullet or an easy way out.
Right.
This is a mess. I mean, back when we started proposing it at the end of September, early October, you can see this on my website, I think it would have been easier to do then, but of course there wasn't political support. And we can go back and agonize over missed opportunities. Probably not that productive. I think going forward, you get the authority, you apply it, you have to apply it to the system. You have to do a proper stress test, not the one they have done now. You have to redo that, which can be done quickly. And then you've got to decide which banks are being taken over, which ones can raise capital privately. And you've got to try and get through that process, which would be incredibly difficult. 3-6 months of receivership, but not a piecemeal approach, a more systematic, comprehensive approach. And then you can start trying to recover from that. But I would stress that the crisis is far from being behind us. I think
right.
We face enormous pressures, and it's very unclear to people who I talk to who are close to the action exactly how we're going to get through this.
Well, you made reference to the stress test, and that was one thing I wanted to discuss is in terms of where we are in this process. I mean, I think we're basically, they're performing these stress tests. They should be finished by the end of April. One thing that seems to me rather a key detail that I think isn't clear yet is the extent to which these stress tests will be made public, and if they are made public, will it be made public on an institutional level? I would guess that you'd be of the mind that they should definitely be made public on an institutional level so people can see with some transparency what's going on with the banks. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that ideally you would have you'll have a system approach, and you would make the results of that public. They're going to be very reluctant to do that. I'm not sure what the intentions are at all. And I think I would also say it's not clear why a stress test takes this long to do. I mean, these banks do stress tests all the time. The point should have been to make them look at a tougher scenario and the losses they would suffer under that scenario. But that should be a relatively straightforward thing. So exactly what is happening in these stress tests, why the time delay is not clear. And of course, there are stories coming out that Wall Street executives are so-called slow walking information to the government. Information that's been requested and required, which strikes me as quite extraordinary. I mean, the taxpayers saved their businesses and their jobs in September and October, and to find them in this kind of non-cooperative mood now, I think indicates that the arrogance of the sector runs pretty deep.
So you have the depending on how the stress test turned out, you have the stress test, and then you also have, apparently there's what they're called the capital assistance program, which is the money that's going to be given to banks based on the stress test assessments, and then you also have this toxic asset program, which seems to me won't be operational until at the very earliest May. It seems that they're extending the application process that long in terms of picking which firms are going to be handling it. I've seen some suggestions that Geithner and basically Obama's administration is going about things taking what some say are the steps you would need to take in order to assess which banks are healthy, which banks are not, so that if receivership was the ultimate means that they came to the conclusion that receivership was the right solution, they would have all the information to do that. Does that seem just like wishful thinking on your part, or do you think that it is reasonable to see what they're doing, so the preparations for that ultimately?
I think that's wishful thinking. I don't rule it out. It may happen, and the sequence of events, events may push them towards this. Let's say towards what I and some others would regard as more sensible actions. But I don't think it's a deliberate perspective or set of policy moves on their side, or it's not heading in that direction. I think they want to keep the banking system in the hands of its current managers, and I think they're bending over backwards to do that. And we'll see whether that works. I think it's going to come under enormous pressure. I mean, I think that this Treasury has not done a good job communicating what it wants to do. I think there's been a history since September of flip-flopping on major policy initiatives, and I think it's going to be very difficult for them to pursue this course, and they may be forced to change.
So to move on to the costs of receivership or whatever we're looking at, even if we don't choose receivership as the route, you noted in your Atlantic piece the last IMF assessment of what the deterioration of U.S. originated assets would be. I think it's 2.2 trillion was the last assessment. There's a London Times piece earlier this week that the upcoming assessment might put that at as high as 3.1 trillion. I mean, it seems to keep on going up. So what is your latest thinking? Is you put the number of 1.5 trillion in terms of the cost of cleaning up the U.S. banking system, and I gather this would be if you do it through receivership, which I would imagine would be the lower cost way of doing it than subsidizing our way out of the crisis. So are you still at 1.5 trillion, or are you going up in the same way that the IMF's estimates are going up?
Well, the IMF produces a global estimate, and I haven't seen this latest number, which is the London Times and Reuters number, which you mentioned, which has been leaked. I haven't had a chance to go back and check. That's calculated on the same basis. But the numbers you mentioned before, the ones that have been published, are all global numbers. And of the global losses, the U.S., again, by the IMF, has been estimated to have about half. And I have to say these numbers have stood up pretty well over time. They weren't done by me or by the department I worked in at the IMF, done by my colleagues. But I think it's some of the best work the IMF has done in recent history, analytical work. So now the 1.5 trillion that I talked about was if you wanted to recapitalize the U.S. banking system and basically fill the losses. Remember, some of the losses that have already been incurred out of this, let's say the number now is 3 trillion. Some of those losses have already been replaced by private capital raising, and the 1.5 trillion would still be consistent with recapitalizing, covering additional losses, recapitalizing the bank system, and actually overcapitalizing it. And it would not, but it would not impose. That was an approach that we were proposing that would not impose costs on the creditors to the banking system. They would be protected. That was the point of our approach, because we were worried about the implications of further defaults. Now, I think that there is no money from Congress to provide that level, that kind of support, and as a result, it doesn't cost you 1.5 trillion. It costs you zero. If you have zero, that's all you can spend, and you do it with debt for equity swaps, which I would emphasize to everyone that is not a free, cheap, easy, pleasant option. Who are the creditors to these banks? Well, they're people. They're us. There are pension funds. There are mutual funds. There are insurance companies. So you're facing additional losses. You're recognizing actually losses that we, the American public, have essentially already incurred in some sense. And we're not going to take them on as future taxes. We're going to take them on as a reduction in the value of the holdings of our various financial instruments, our mutual funds, and so on. So it's pretty serious. Either way, we bear the costs, and it's going to be quite a mess. But I think this is what we'll do because of the way things have been handled. It'll be debt for equity swaps in a receivership framework, hopefully with a proper resolution authority backing it up. Hopefully, by the way, with sufficient protection for workers in bankruptcy. Of course, in Chapter 11, they do have some well-established protections. It's not clear how the resolution authority is going to handle that. I would also point out that the global dimensions of handling this kind of receivership are immensely complicated, and sadly, and for no good reason, the G20 declined to take that up. So while I think they did achieve some things at their recent summit, this handling of the cross-border issues of bank failures is a huge problem going forward.
So do I hear you saying that you think this is where we're going, not necessarily where we should go, but this is where we're going?
Well, look, I mean, I'm a realist, not
right.
particularly an idealist, and I recognize political realities when they slap me in the face. And I don't think there's money from Congress. I think the president has decided that anything that walks and talks like nationalization is off the table. And, that's his call, and I respect the president immensely. So I think this is where we're heading. So in that scenario, the banks would go into receivership and would sort of mediate this debt for equity swap on a large scale, and they wouldn't. That's sort of, I haven't heard that scenario before. So that's a different way of doing things. I mean, interesting. So so if you were to game this out, you would see this happening, like, given that the pace that the U.S. is working through these stress tests and such. This is something that you would expect to see, in the summer, I guess, is your prognostication. Well, the timing of these things is always very, very hard. The hardest thing to predict is the timing. I mean, if you look at the credit default swap spread on big banks right now, they're widening very rapidly. They were widening over the past few weeks when we were having a stock market rally. So I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later, unless the Treasury or the Fed has some kind of new subsidy scheme they can throw into the balance. But I think at this point it's all pretty small stuff compared to the scale of the problem. And of course there is no external financial support available of any scale that would matter for the United States. So I rather think it's going to come sooner rather than later, just looking at the logic of the events and looking at how these things have unfolded in the past.
Well, if there was such a scenario, you call for essentially breaking the oligarchy. If things play out in this way, or even if through somehow subsidization continues for a long period of time and the banks continue to limp along, is there a way that we make it out of this crisis with the current oligarchy in place? Is there something in the argument that the oligarchy is being humbled by this set of circumstances currently, and this idea of limiting bank size, is the banking sector going to be naturally limited just by the course of events?
Well, I think that the limping along scenario is definitely possible. The so-called zombie banks, as they were termed in Japan in the 1990s, is one possibility. I guess the way I was describing it, sounded like there would be a moment of decision and a moment of potentially when you would take the oligarchs out of the situation.
Right.
But realistically, these are incredibly powerful people. They've got a real grip on thinking, and they will, I'm sure, be able to find ways to preserve their position. So I would not want to exaggerate the decisiveness or the with regards to power structure. I don't think we're on the eve of a big shift away from the established oligarchy, the established belief system. That is going to be a much longer struggle.
And perhaps something that if there's we're talking about large cultural forces. We're talking about, a financial crisis that, even though it's, arguably at its peak right now, it's going to take years to play out. So you're saying that this is more of a glacial shift than something that's going to, happen overnight.
Well, I think there'll be financial market developments that will happen faster. But in terms of the power structure and the belief system shifting, it would be very unusual for those to move so quickly. When the IMF's involved, there's an external pressure, and there's a collapse element of the entire economy that is sometimes helpful, and many times, by the way, the elite survives even that. So don't rule them out in terms of their ability to survive.
And if they survive this, what won't they survive? I guess is the question.
Yeah, and what kind of risks will they shy away from in the future? Remember, what comes out of this, I think, could be a financial structure with even fewer big players, even more concentration of power, and then these guys have an even greater ability to call on the government to bail them out in the future.
So I've seen the counter argument that, while necessarily there's going to be some big banks that disappear, what's really needed is to shrink the banking sector. But what you're saying is, if you're left with a diminished banking sector but still three enormously powerful players, you're still going to have the same problem.
I think the banking sector, as a percent of GDP, will shrink of its own accord because there's going to be less demand for some of these financial services that weren't that productive. The question is going to be the size of the biggest banks. How big are your biggest banks relative to GDP? And if they're large, if they have assets and liabilities, a balance sheet, 10, 20% of GDP, that's bad. If they're 1 or 2% of GDP, that's also potentially too big. Okay, I think they should be much smaller. And by the way, an alternative future for us looks more like Europe, in which the biggest banks are even bigger. So the Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, in the UK, is 2 times 200% of UK GDP, not 20%, 200%. And that's crazy. I don't think you can really run an economy on that basis, but that is what they've done in Europe. And if that's where our banks are heading to, we're going to have much bigger problems down the road. Okay,
and I just wanted to give you also one chance. You guys put out your baseline scenario for, I think you do this periodically on your website, baseline scenario. So what is your current, what is your current, I guess, what is the baseline scenario, I guess is the easiest way to ask the question. And not having you reprise the entire thing, but just sort of your view of the recovery and the shape of the recovery and that sort of thing.
Our view of the shape of the recovery is it's not a V, it's not a U, the more gradual recovery, it's an L. So the economy goes down, and then at the global level and the US level, and then it stays down for a while. So we really struggle to recover. And this is like Japan in the 1990s, with balance sheet problems, consumers don't feel comfortable spending, firms don't want to go out and invest, everybody tries to reduce their debts and hunker down. The ability of government to offset that at sufficient scale is quite limited. We think that in that context, the monetary policy being pursued by the Fed in the US makes a lot of sense. We have more problems with the macroeconomic policies in other countries, particularly monetary policy in Europe. We think is problematic and not moving in the right direction. And we think that the financial rescue piece of the US economy is a big, important additional risk. I would say that in our baseline scenario, these financial bad things happen and they're kind of absorbed and we stay at this flat level. In the downside scenario, additional financial shocks push us down further and also spread globally in a way that honestly is distinctly reminiscent of the beginning of the Great Depression.
Well, so the extent to which you're critical of the U.S. approach, you're more critical of the European approach. And does that go also with their sort of treatment of their oligarchy?
Yeah, the European, I mean, in terms of broad macro policies, monetary policy, fiscal policy, we think that, the key people in the U.S. do get it. They do understand how severe these things are. It's that, to us, the financial rescue bailout part that really stands out as being not appropriate, too weak, and I think that's where the special interests come into play. In Europe, the political elite doesn't really understand the depth of the issue. They're very hung up on inflation and the risks of inflation. And this, I think, plays out, or interacts with the interests of their powerful players, their massive financial sector, and their oligarchs, if you like, in a way that doesn't give you the kind of stimulative policies. So that's dangerous in other ways. They have, of course, taken over their banks. They have nationalized or quasi-nationalized a bunch of their banks. That creates, by the way, other problems. Now you have politicians running the banks, not something I would ever advise for any country. I think you want private banks. I think you want small banks. I think you want to be watching out for banks becoming bigger and more powerful. You don't want massive banks controlled by politicians. That's a different kind of recipe for disaster.
So is there anyone doing things right now?
Is anyone? Well, no, not in a complete sense. But the U.S. is doing a lot of things right, okay? Mm-hmm. And we emphasize that on the website also. We like pretty much. I mean, housing policy, for example, it's messy, it's complicated, but it's heading in the right direction. The fiscal stimulus we might have structured a little bit differently, but basically we're on board with that. Monetary policy, we're out in front. We published an article in the Washington Post Outlook section on Sunday explaining where Bernanke was coming from, identifying and emphasizing the risks that he's taking, but supporting him in taking those risks, okay? Because we see the severity of the downside scenario as being so bad that we're willing to take on what we regard as a much more serious inflation risk than the Fed. The Fed is willing to. The Fed thinks that they're doing, or argues in public that they're doing. So. We are, and we think the Obama administration did very well at the G20. We think that the measures coming out of the G20, particularly strengthening the IMF, reforming its governance, and getting new resources into the hands of the IMF are steps, maybe baby steps, but steps in the right direction on a global scale. That's definitely Obama administration, definitely Treasury initiative. So we're very happy to commend them on sensible policies when we see them. The problem is the way they've approached the banking system and the financial sector. It's dangerous. It's not going to prove sustainable, I think, and we're going to have to move on in a way that's going to be, ultimately costly to all of us, either as taxpayers or as people who are trying really hard to save for our retirements.
Okay, I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you.